I suggest you do research on a gentleman by the name of Sir Francis Galton. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He had this method, which he called a way to tame and colonize the dark continent, which was Africa, or which is Africa. And he had a very well planned out proposal as to have the Chinese settle in Africa and integrate into the different countries of Africa as immigrants and obtain positions in the government, in the business sector, and take control, seize power in the different countries. The Chinese are very crafty people, and I would title this as an invitation to colonization by the Chinese as it relates to Africa. Because I believe the Chinese, they have a very well thought out, well planned long-term venture with Africa, and the reason why they're making these loans and building these roads, they'll build infrastructure throughout Africa in many of the countries, and they're migrating by the thousands to many different African countries. And it wasn't long ago when the Europeans and the Americans, or as they consider themselves as the West, was doing business in Africa, throughout Africa. And they were, let's face it, they were taking a lot of the natural resources. And they were making loans, but their loans were, they had stipulations behind them. Some humanitarian, some they wanted to track the money to make sure that it wasn't going in the hands of a dictator or in one person's hands, make sure that it wasn't being used for militaries and things of that nature. Whereas the Chinese are different. They don't really care about humanitarian purposes. And they don't have all of these different stipulations on the money that they loan and the things that they're able to do in Africa. So the Africans, of course, being poor countries, as they say, and needing money, are open to doing business with the Chinese and allowing the Chinese to come in and virtually take over. I mean, imagine a person or family or group from another country coming to your country and building a community and not allowing you to have access to that particular area of land, even though they don't particularly own it. I mean, they're foreigners, they're immigrants. Unless they get special permission from the government. Now, how would they be able to do that? Of course, by, as we say, greasing some palms, which is none other than bribes and paying money for favors. And that money could be set up in some offshore account or some account which is not in their homeland. So those type of things happen. But you know, the Chinese, they're colonizing Africa in a roundabout way, which I don't think the Africans are fully aware of. I think right now what they're seeing is, okay, here's China. They have all this money. They're making these loans. They're going to help us build our country. It's great. Everything is great. They're allowed to come in. They bring their ships in. They bring the military. They help us in policing now. And they also are supplying us with arms, weapons. And that kind of took me back to the days of slavery, because what is it that the rulers of the different tribes did when they traded slaves? What did they trade them for? They traded them for trinkets. In the Chinese case, they have these cheap toys and other products that they make. And during slavery, they also traded or exchanged slaves for guns. In China's case, they're supplying these AK-47s that they make, some other weapons, grenades, missiles, aircraft, right? So it seems like history is just repeating itself, but just with a different player. And of course, they're not directly trading for slaves, but indirectly, they're paying slave wages, because I think the Chinese companies are paying the African people $1 or less per day to mine on some of these mines, and who knows what else. And it's been said that there's roughly about 1 million or so Chinese in Africa, but there's no real way to know how many Chinese are there, because those Chinese ships, when they unload, I mean, they unload more than just products and weapons. They unload families. And the thing about the Chinese is that the families, the people that settled in Africa, are financially backed by the Chinese government. Now, this is just me thinking, but what would happen if the Chinese took control of Africa and all of its natural resources? what do you think would happen as far as America is concerned? How would America stack up against a China with then, if it happens, if they were to control Africa and all of its natural resources, to be compared to the United States? How would they stack up against each other? Do you think at that time China would then be the number one power in the world? Think about it for a minute. If China was able to have access to all of the oil that's in Africa, all of the gold that's in Africa, all of the natural resources there, why would China need to do any business with any Western country? They would never need to. And since they have most of the factories now, the world would be then dependent upon China, making China the most powerful nation on the planet. Just something to think about, because I don't think that's something that America anticipated. I mean, we're here bickering over and fighting over Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, black and white, while the Chinese are making strategic moves. So anyway, it's just something that I think needs to be thought about. So let's imagine that the Chinese had taken over the natural resources of Africa. And they required that anyone who came to Africa had to use their currency, the Chinese renminbi, instead of the US dollar or some other European currency. How do you think that would affect the world's currency? And also, let's think about this now. If China were to take over Africa's natural resources, let's say gold in particular, and they had it where their currency was backed by gold, what effect do you think that would have on the US dollar, if any? Now, on the one hand, you'd have China with its wealth, and you'd have Africa now being controlled, or its natural resources being controlled by the Chinese government. How do you think that would stack up to the currency of the U.S. and other westernized countries? Could you imagine if they required any other country, any visitor, to use the renminbi instead of the US dollar? as a legal tender? Just something to think about.